I am going to share my screen with the hot off the presses chapter newsletter for the month and let you all read it because it's better than having me talk through it. Shout out if there's any questions. I assume it's coming through okay.
Huh.
What's that?
Well, it appears as though my camera has failed again.
I see that, or don't see that.
Yes. Well, it's okay. You can, it's just as well because I was going to be embarrassed about the fact that I move my lips when I read.
Well, that's okay. Sometimes I trace underneath things with my finger on the screen. So something I didn't remember until somebody was watching me in a Zoom call.
Yeah, Zoom calls, you get lulled because you're in your own home and, very familiar, and you don't realize. And, the old trick that newsmen and television stations do where they only wear a nice shirt and then they wear shorts or something less below. And if you stand up at a Zoom call, you could be surprised, right? I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And Doug made it. Hey, he was driving from up north, as I recall. Or maybe he didn't. Okay. Well, might as well get moving. I had the pleasure of having lunch with Rich about a week ago where we sat and talked about all of this, and I'm pretty excited to hear what he's got to say. Rich Redmond, as you all know, has a long and a distinguished career in this business, and he has agreed to join us with some thoughts about things that involve FM radio station audio, but may not necessarily be associated with the audio processor. So with no further ado, Rich Redmond.
Thank you, Chuck. Let's see if I can, I think you need to enable sharing for me to share a screen. Okay. You guys seeing a slide? It's coming
Sure
through?
am.
Okay, great.
Yeah,
Well,
I got it now.
Yeah. So, one of the things that I guess over time I've become somewhat passionate about is looking beyond the audio processor to enhance your station. And while I'm generally talking about FM here, really applies to just about everything. I guess the one thing in all my travels I've come to learn is, you can't assume that even some of the most basic things are caught even in some of the largest markets. So, with that, if you want to shout out with questions, I'm not that structured here, but so anyway, that's me, the required picture and a little bit about it. So what I thought we'd talk about today is, just kind of go through audio and radio stations. I think everybody generally goes, well, I want to sound great. Some people even go for, what they call a signature sound, really where, when you hear a station, exactly what that sound signature is. And a lot of guys are good at making that happen. But I think sometimes an inordinate amount of effort or focus gets put around the audio processor because it's the most exciting thing. For sure, it's got a lot of handles and it can be really powerful and it's an important part, but there's probably a lot of other things that can impact having a great sounding station. And so if you think of the broader signal flow, and that's kind of where I'm going to go down the path, there really are a bunch of key points that you need to look at that often get overlooked. Certainly content and source materials key. The STL is important. A lot of times in FM, people overlook the exciter. I don't know how many times I've seen somebody running, the latest and greatest Omni or Orban, and they're going through a, 15-year-old $1,000 exciter, and they don't understand why they just don't have the same sound as someone else who, has an Omni 11. The performance of the transmitter, especially if it's not solid state, antennas and how they play, how you're measuring. And really all of these things add up for the whole that's more than any one piece. Excuse me. So if I a lot of times just like to think of things in a simple flow from left to right of where the content starts and where it's going. And then we'll just kind of step through these pieces. For sure, the audio processor's in there, more just to give a reference, but I wasn't really going to spend a lot of time on that. But any one of these points in the air chain can certainly have an impact. And while I've kind of shown an exporter, assuming that, the system could have HD radio, I'll just kind of talk about the signal flow in general without spending too much time on analog versus HD between the two of these. And, I was thinking about, audio processors, and, this picture just kind of jumped out at me. You can have stacks and stacks of boxes. And as a friend of mine who at the time was the chief engineer of a New York City radio station, they have a common transmitter site on top of the Empire State Building. And at that time, they split their processing. They had dedicated lines between the studio and the transmitter. And so he really was running an 8100 and a Mod Sciences composite clipper and a little bit of equalization. But in the rack were a pile of other boxes, some DAPs and some different compressors and other equalizers that he basically had paralleled the inputs up. And, some of his competitors would come and peek in to see what he had. And it looked like he had 3 racks full of gear when factually it was a lot less. And I think sometimes that's where, we can get really hung up on that. But, even at the audio processor level, sometimes just understanding the basics. I visited a station in upstate New York, where I'm originally from, know the owner, and I stopped in to see him when I was headed back. And I said, geez, Clay, I know you had recently gotten some new processing, but your station's sounding awfully small. And so we went in and looked at his engineer happened to be around, and he had gotten some new Omnia gear, but his engineer somehow misunderstood that an Omnia 6 isn't really designed to go in front of an 8100 Optimod. It's supposed to actually replace the 8100. And so he had set all this stuff up and then kind of ran it into his existing processing and, moved a few patch cords around, and amazingly the station sounded a lot bigger. And he was looking at me and trying to understand, well, how do you know this? Where can I find that information? And it's like, well, probably the manual over there in the box you haven't bothered to open up would be useful. And so, I think while a lot of us are around stuff and, it may seem to be basic, sometimes just reviewing and making sure there's not something simple that was overlooked. Or, if you're helping out somebody who's new or maybe not so knowledgeable, just understanding the basic building blocks of how things go together and what things should be in the chain and shouldn't be. I think the other just comment relative to processors are, we all probably have some nostalgia for great boxes or air chains we had in the past, but, there've been some pretty significant advancements. And so, having a working museum is not really the same as having the most contemporary tools to go to market. So, I think, while everybody's got their favorite settings and favorite boxes, and, I'm not really going to pick one. I do think understanding their place in the chain and how you use them's pretty important. I guess I'll start at the antenna and work back. having a good symmetrical group delay through the antenna system is pretty important to having a decent sounding FM signal. Now, sometimes, I think everybody kind of knows, geez, I want the transmitter to match into the antenna and I want to have low viswar. And you'll see guys taking pictures of their transmitters and showing I have 0 viswar, I have 1 watt. And, while as a general indicator of health, that's a good thing. If you've inadvertently narrow banded the antenna to get a low viswar on the viswar meter and the transmitter reflected power, you may not actually be helping yourself. And so I just kind of inherently show, not very technical, but, having a wide band pass so that the full FM signal passes versus narrow banding the antenna can make a really big difference in how the stereo sounds, how much multipath the station has. And, a number of years ago, I had helped a station upgrade their antenna and sold them some gear. And I got a call from the day after they installed it and said, this antenna is horrible. I put it on, my coverage is worse than it was before. And so we kind of went through some steps and found that while meaning well, the engineer had the tower rigger adjust the fine matching transformers on his Shively antenna, the kind of plunger type matching transformer at the base of the antenna, and managed to narrow band it. So the viswar meter, which he was optimizing for on his low power transmitter, was a class A on top of a mountain, so a few hundred watts. The viswar meter looked great. Unfortunately, the station performance was bad. So we got the riggers back and had them put the plungers back to the factory mark spot, and then just put a small jumper between the transmitter and the transmission line to match up to the viswar meter in the transmitter. Station performed really well. And, as I had thought of that over my career, I kind of wrote that off to maybe a smaller market, mistake that people can make. Well, much to my surprise, fast forward 15, 20 years, I was in a large major market on the East Coast between New York City and Baltimore with a top station, and we were driving around. The guys were having some coverage issues, and I was talking about picket fencing and multipath, and he goes, "Oh, well, by the way, we run in mono." I said, "Well, really?" And this was an FM music station owned by a major group, and he says, "Yeah, we've been that way for the 15 years I've been here." And so, I'm asking him some more questions as the day goes on, and well, come to find out that when he had put up the new directional antenna 15 years ago, the viswar meter didn't match well into the antenna. So he had the tower riggers get in and start moving slugs around in the transmission line to make it match. And since then, he, I guess, had not connected that was part of the reason that he was not running in stereo. And when I'd asked him if he had ever swept the antenna, he had said, well, not exactly, but ERI had been here working on one of the other guys' antennas in my building. He's up on a rooftop in a tall building. And so they, took a few minutes and swept the antenna, and the guys said they had never seen anything so ugly. And so, as the conversation went on, it's like, well, Tom, maybe these are clues as to why it's not performing really well. And so, I mention it because it's one of those things that can be out of sight, out of mind. Of course, antennas can deteriorate over time, or it may just be that, you match up based on the viswar and it looks pretty good. But, using, traditionally you might use a network analyzer or a tracking generator with a spectrum analyzer to do a return loss measurement. Or Chuck and I were talking the other day about, was it a VNA, Chuck?
Mini VNA, yeah.
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 Very inexpensive tool now that, while you can't use it in a high RF field, can give you some idea of what's going on. So, for sure, it's definitely something to think about.
Before you go away from,
Yeah.
I'll give you a worst case example of that, Rich. I was in Southeast Asia at a transmitter site for a very large network, a nationwide governmental broadcaster. And I'm looking at the transmitter, and the viswar meter is modulating with the audio. And it turns out that this was a combined system. The combiners had been narrow banded to the point where a major part of the occupied bandwidth was in a very high visbar area. So
Yeah, I can believe it. I can
awful,
believe it.
awful.
Exactly. Exactly. So, while you don't see in this case, just kind of highlighting, some of these like Shively and a few others do have fine matching transformers. Others have slugs that are in the line like ERI rototillers. They often have some way of matching, but you just need to be careful that you don't do that without, paying attention. Not so much when we move to the transmitter. For sure, in solid state, it gets a lot easier. They tend to, the bandwidth that we all want generally is there, and the performance, things like AM noise and whatnot, are generally good. I say generally because not all are equal, but for sure, most are quite good. If we're still running tube rigs, it's important to pay attention to the bandwidth. So just as Chuck mentioned, you can, in some cases, it's the output is running into something that doesn't have an appropriate load. In other cases, most frequently, it's actually the input to the amplifier, that the grid is, perhaps been tweaked again to kind of, minimize the viswar that you might see from a driver section. And paying attention to that, and usually the point of low viswar is usually not the best point of bandwidth. It's usually to one side or the other, but that'll impact AM noise. It narrow bands the signal, and again, I've been surprised. I guess maybe just a comment on me. My time as a chief engineer started in smaller markets, and then kind of worked up from there. And but always, growing up in upstate New York, which is much smaller than New York City for sure, I always kind of had this assumption that, once you made it to New York City, that's where the best of the best were. And for sure, a lot of guys are very, very good. But, believe it or not, on, some of my trips to the Empire State Building, I was amazed at how many, contemporary FM stations that at the time were running tube transmitters had, reflected power meters bouncing around, as Chuck had suggested. And, attention to tuning wasn't as crisp as you would expect. So even with older gear and in smaller markets, there's things you can do, that can really help. The other point that I make, and by what I mean by this, ensure that the RF gain is in their sweet spot, especially on some of the older rigs. Like I think these are Harris HT20 and 25s. The old exciters had a much lower drive, and so they were like 15-watt drive. So then there was a pre-driver and then the IPA. And in some cases, especially if you weren't running at full power, or maybe the exciters changed over time, those power levels were ratcheted back in some cases to the point where you weren't using very much gain, and those amplifiers got into a point where they weren't very linear. And so, I had a colleague of mine in Boston was really fighting AM noise and performance issues, and we bypassed the pre-driver that was in there and just put the exciter into the IPA, and the performance opened right up. So again, didn't touch anything audio wise, just got the amplification into the points that it was running in a linear and sweet mode. And so those are things that sometimes over time, we see a lot of guys have put in, whether it be like Nautels or some other products. Sometimes they're, BE or Gates Air, newer exciters into older transmitters, perhaps Elenos, other ones, and totally bypass the whole IPA stage and go exciter direct to tube. And those, again, you can get some really nice results by getting rid of some things that, again, are not audio, but do have a pretty big impact. I mentioned exciters. This is one that again, I'm kind of floored. I'll see guys get enamored about, and again, I have nothing against the best processors for sure. When I was a chief, I always enjoyed having, a lot of knobs to turn, and I did invest a lot in processing, but um, I'm amazed at guys who will be out there deciding whether they need, an 8700i, or they want the Omnia 11, and they're either running some 20-year-old second rate exciter, or something that's just not real high quality. And I'm not saying that it has to be a digital exciter, although the BE, Nautel, and Gates Air direct to channel digital exciters and some of the other guys that make those are very, very good, and the performance is significant. And so it's an area that, in my opinion, you can swap this out, and for most stations it's every bit as impactful as changing the audio processor. Huge impact, both from an audio performance standpoint, and things, guys go, geez, the bass got tighter, the high seems more open. And it makes sense, because the audio input sections have changed over time, and even with earlier digital products. I mean, the Digit was a great exciter when it came out, back in the 90s, but times moved on. So even if it's well maintained and the caps aren't dried out and all that other stuff, audio performance has improved quite a bit. And so it's a key point. The other thing I will say about exciters is, everything has its job, and for the most part they're not audio processors, and the stereo generators built in them aren't great. They're really much better when the stereo generators left to be integrated with the processing. So if you are running discrete to the transmitter site, and you have the opportunity to either run like AES 192 or analog composite, or if your processors at the transmitter site, for sure take advantage of the more I guess I would say optimized stereo generators. That the ones that are in the exciters are certainly better than what was in them 20, 30 years ago, but transmitter designers are generally not audio processor designers. And so while they can do many of the same things, they just don't pay attention to the same points. The STL, kind of the same thing. It's the attention to detail. In the analog world, frequency stability and drift can have a big impact. Generally, stations I've taken care of in the past that use analog links, on a regular basis, I would adjust the frequency of the transmitters and match up the receivers, and every time I would see one, a little bit less overshoot, but two, the stereo image got a lot better. While things like the Mosley DSP 6000 were pretty cutting edge when it came out back in the 90s, you're still running aptX compression, which in and of itself isn't horrible, but anytime you can get rid of data reduction, you're doing yourself a favor. And again, the DSP 6000s are 30 some years old. So the chip selections in there and sample rate converters are just not as contemporary as what you can get in even very inexpensive products today. IP codecs, lots of different flavors and varieties. Again, I'm a big fan that if you can, first transmit linear, second, distribute composite. It's a little bit cleaner. For sure, a good way to go. But the investment in these links, there are a lot of good ones to use. Generally, I would say, steer clear of the super inexpensive ones. There's the whole transport layer issue of how you get there and how robust is it, what type of error mitigation it has. But from an audio performance standpoint, linear, for sure. Bandwidth is relatively inexpensive these days, and just like storage, it's really no need to use data reduction. EAS, I only mention this from the standpoint of I've seen all digital plants where guys pay a lot of attention to that and then go through some manky converter to go back to going analog through NDEC boxes or some other relay switching. Again, it's not a bad thing, but every time you go to have a conversion, all those add up, and whether you stayed analog or you stay digital, I'm not purporting to say digital is the answer for everything. But if you are going to use both, just paying attention to how many times you go through conversions and the quality of converters can certainly add up. And index are just one of those things that get put in the box. I generally talk about switching, whether you think of this as studio switching or, maybe I've got an older analog plant with patch bays. But I guess in a contemporary, environment and audio over IP, the switching and mixing is all done within the fabric of, WheatNet or Axia or, like an SAS or whomever's product you pick. But, I would say my experience has been sometimes, people have active audio switchers in their air chain that some of them don't have great headroom, some don't have good audio performance. If you are in an analog environment, or even an AES environment, simple relay-based switching like the broadcast tools can be quite useful and usually sounds quite good. Look for distribution amps that are hidden someplace. I've had more guys all of a sudden find that stuff was going through DAs they didn't realize, sometimes because of not great documentation over time. And again, you're just some cases adding gain stages that are mismatched, and you lose headroom and clarity. And so, especially in an analog environment, I talk about tracing the signal paths. So a station I had done some work for a while back, I think the guy who had been there years before, his Brady label book only went up to 15, because I found lots of number 1s and 2s and 3s throughout the plant that didn't all go to where you thought they went. And then someone along the time had started using these bread bag ties as cable labeling, and they would write a number on it and just kind of push it on the end of the wire. But by tracing through it, what we ended up finding was for this FM station, over time, somebody had added mono mix down pads at 3 different points in the program loop. And so they could never understand why they didn't have very good stereo separation, to the point of buying a stereo enhancement processor. And once we found that really the problem was there were 3 dBY pads hung across their stereo program to create mono mix downs, once we cleaned those out, the stereo enhancer kind of burned a hole in the middle of the dial. We had to dial it back. So, basic, going through, and because, especially if you're taking over a plant from someone, you don't know what's there. It may seem innocuous. These things were kind of in the, no one really knew. I think they went to an old, music on hold and a few other things. So again, if you've gone AOIP, those types of issues kind of go away. Relative to mixing, again, generally the audio performance on even the lowest cost mixer today that you can buy is usually much better than some of the things that a lot of us grew up with. I would bet that you probably sold a bunch of those over time, Chuck. They
weren't bad in the day.
Exactly. And, I had plenty of stations I had and was involved in a lot of BE and, older Harris gear and, LPBs and so forth. But, the audio performance on those generally compared to what you can get today, even, compared to some prosumer stuff is, kind of night and day. And so, while for sure a lot of, we all like to jump sometimes to the best stuff, even just getting something that's got better audio performance, don't overlook the console. Yes, it can be a big challenge to swap one out, and there's all kinds of other issues that goes through making those changes, but the sonic performance improvement again can be really big over time. And so whether you like to stay with analog, guys like Audio Arts make some very inexpensive, good sounding analog consoles. There are others as well. Even again, from a sound integrity, even some of the Mackeys and stuff can sound pretty good. But then, you go through the digital lines from Wheatstone and Axia and, again, pick your flavor. All provide infinitely better audio performance than a lot of the stuff that, while it's very rugged and it's generally easy to work on, assuming the parts aren't unobtainium, the performance is just not that great. And even early digital systems, by the way, there was a time when people ran a lot of different sample rates and different mixers, and they went through a lot of A to Ds and D to As. Um, eliminating those, whether it's I'm an audio over IP and I go from IP in my, play out system directly into my audio over IP system versus going through sound cards and stepping down into a node and then back. All those conversions add up. I mentioned source material, in a kind of discrete way. Everyone knows at some point, CDs were better than tapes and records, but they had their own issues. Hard disk systems, became incredibly powerful and convenient. A lot of them used compression, needingly so, because, disk space was at a premium. I think I remember in the early days when I was selling Audio Vault, like a 9 gig hard drive was $5 or $6 grand. I mean, I don't know, today, like a 2 terabyte USB drives, under $100. So storage is cheap. So there's really no reason to use data compression. But the thing is, it's not so much what you're recording today, it's your library. And so there's oftentimes a lot of stuff in the library. Maybe the program director or somebody, pulled something off YouTube, or they got a clip from someplace. And, you'll wonder why, despite all the good work that I've done, geez, I'm listening to this, and for some reason we don't sound great on this song. Well, before you go ripping up track on everything else and playing with the processors for hours, having your guys be diligent and going through the libraries and trying to clean out some of these MP3s and other, compressed source material goes a long way to get you, sonic quality that can be quite good. And then, all the way back to the front end, again, everybody's got their favorite brand of microphone. I just grabbed a picture of an RE20. Some guys would say I'd have nothing else. Others wouldn't be caught dead with it. But whatever your brand of microphone, test some out. But for sure, get some. I think it's important that match to the users. I've been places where guys have really great microphones, but the caliber of talent doesn't really match up with it, and they're not really good at using, condenser microphones. So making sure that you've got something of good sonic quality, of decent reliability, and if you're using a mic processor, that it's well maintained and set up. Those, especially the earlier ones, pots could get really noisy on those, and you could have a bunch of distortion simply because of aged pots. With audio over IP systems, a lot of times the processing's built in, so you don't need to do it outboard anymore. But a decent mic processor can go a long way to cleaning up room noise as well. So again, while it's not the main processor, it's not to be overlooked. But in general, again, I would say, a cheap microphone in the studio, despite having a $10,000 audio processor, it's kind of hard to overcome the source. So, as I just think about it, and I know we kind of railed through a bunch of points here, but all these tiny things add up. And most of the time, it's not even tied to how much money you have to spend or, the size of market. These things, we all get busy and they're all over the place, right? And sometimes there are limitations that either we didn't know were there or you just kind of live with. And sometimes looking at them with a fresh pair of eyes gives you a different point of view. Especially the RF chain, while it's usually not where people think of when you talk about, we really want to go make this station rock. I know Chuck's probably experienced it, as I'm sure many of you have. You swap out an exciter for somebody and man, the station sounds like $1 million. Or they say, geez, I put this new transmitter in and somebody asked me what I did to the audio. I haven't even touched it. And, many people think, well, I don't know, I plugged the composite in and it's all just RF. That shouldn't have any impact on my audio. But factually it does. Antenna bandwidth, a big deal. Chuck kind of mentioned earlier, if you're in a combined antenna system, paying attention to the fact that that the combiner hasn't drifted. I had some guys I had done some work with, and the cans on the antenna were not mounted vertically. You know, where they weren't like this with X number of cans sitting on the floor. They had been mounted horizontally for space, and what had happened over time is the rods inside started to droop, and the filters became untuned. And so they started, everybody's pass band started to shift, and you started to put energy into the combiners. That'll become even more prevalent if you have a problem and you're trying to run HD radio, and your HD radio performance won't be that great. But just as a note, there's a lot of things environmentally like that, how they're mounted, and heat and cold over time that can affect the tuning of combined systems, and all that adds up. I mean, I'd had a customer of mine in Boston was trying to figure out why this station he went past when he went to go visit his parents in Maine sounded so much better than what he was running in Boston. And he at the time was convinced it was the transmitter. And as we got down to it, we started to figure out, well, the station he was comparing to was studio and transmitter was co-located. There was no STL or phone lines. It had a good quality straight wire audio console. It went to some straightforward processing. It was a relatively new transmitter and all wideband antenna. And in his case, he had a double hop STL. He had a transmitter that actually had some poor bandwidth issues. He was into a combined antenna system in a large multi-station combiner. And so, as we kind of stepped through it, it was like you could compare the audio processors, and that was certainly part of why one station sounded different than the other. But in the one case, it just happened that everything was fairly aligned, and there was less complexity for the station that he heard that was out of the market. That all adds up. Yeah, so that's, again, as I kind of think about all these things and think about what I've run into, I guess I'm continued to either be happy to see that some of the basic principles still apply, wherever I've gone and taken a look at. And in some cases, I guess, disappointed that we haven't been able to get by some of these things, and that they still haunt us or bother stations that, just miss the opportunity to improve because we sometimes limit our thinking to audio improvement is primarily around getting the next biggest processor. So anyway, that's, those were kind of my thoughts. I'm happy to have a dialogue or answer questions or, take criticism whatever floats your boat.
I don't think you're going to get a lot of criticism, Rich. I would.
Well, criticism's okay.
I would stress a couple of points that you made, and to expand on the comment about the grid tuning. I used to tune the grid because the grid has the largest impedance transformation of the tube stages, and as a result, the Q is the highest, and that's why tuning is so important. So I used to tune the grid for minimum crosstalk. Dynamically look at your crosstalk region. Absolutely, that worked very well. But the best way to solve that particular problem, all the major manufacturers these days sell like a 1 kilowatt transmitter that's got a built-in digital exciter, and they're dirt cheap, cheaper than an audio processor.
Yes.
And you replace that entire IPA stage, feed the grid of the tube if you've got to match it, or many of them are 50 ohm input anyway. And boy, it'll make a massive difference. The other thing that you said that I absolutely agree on, you mentioned that MPX 256, the 256 kilo composite.
Oh yeah, AES 192.
Yeah. So another name for that is MPX over AES. And probably the biggest thing that I have heard make a massive difference in the audio quality of a station these days is that the MPX over AES, a full digital. You got a digital audio processor, you've got a digital exciter. Why go freaking down to analog through A to Ds and D to As, or even worse, run use the internal stereo generator in the exciter. The last thing I would like your comment on, and you hear an awful lot of discussion about it, is the poor quality of the incoming source material we get, either from production agencies for commercials and whatnot, but also even in the music. The stuff that, if you look at it on an oscilloscope or there's no dynamics anymore to the incoming source material that you can have the best audio chain in the world. But if the incoming stuff is garbage, you're going to get garbage out. Thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with you there. I think, I guess the thing I think about goes back to my point of routing out or rooting out MP3s and stuff in your library. Because I am amazed sometimes that, I'll have dialogues with guys who will make a point about nothing's recorded good anymore. And, there's no headroom and there's all this distortion. And there's truth to be said to all of that, which, frankly, there's not a lot we can do to change it. But look, you got to control the things you can control. And so sometimes, whether it's that particular point or, similarly, there have been guys who get hung up on, I want tube type mic preamps to go with my favorite microphone. Again, and you go, yeah, that's great, but you're running MP3s for your audio. So I don't know who you're kidding here. Right. So it's kind of like, yeah, for sure. There is a lot to be said about how the music's recorded. I think it does mean you need to pay attention to your processing a little bit differently than if you've got a gold-based library and it's recorded from a past period of time. But, grabbing the songs, that are pre-compressed, I think those are the things that sneak in and get you. Now, can you do much about what comes from the ad agencies? Not a lot, but also, don't make matters worse. I've seen guys record stuff and somehow people end up putting another layer of compression on things when they save a file and send it to a second station. You may make a lot more recordings and passes. So I can't stress enough is paying attention to the library. Because if you think about it, for most stations, with the exception of some hypercurrent stations, I don't know what 80+% of what's going out over the air is coming from your library. That's the same day in and day out. Yeah, okay. Some stations it's 100%, some stations maybe it's only 30%, but for sure, depending on your format, a lot of it comes from your library. So I'm with you, Chuck. You got it. There's some of this stuff we can't do a lot about, but I think it gets made worse when you have all these other issues in your chain. And it's like, I always use stuff like Steely Dan that was recorded in the 70s and early 80s. In my opinion, fairly well recorded music, plenty of dynamic range. But because it's well recorded and you've got a lot of dynamic range, when you would go through some gain stages that had clipping or you were overly aggressive, you started with something that was perhaps more pristine or more forgiving. When you've got music that's got a ton of compression and, they're very up near full scale digital in the level, you don't have much room for forgiveness. So all these other things, I think, just aggravate it more. I don't know if that's really the answer to your question or what you were asking.
Yeah, I mean, we have to deal with what the quality. I think this is why some stations require that all spots be voiced locally. Is they can, what's your comment about controlling what you can control? They're trying to keep an overall sound of the station. Some of my favorite stations did that. Other comments? We could talk this way just like we do over lunch, Rich, but anybody else got comments they would like to bring up? Doug, I saw you had your mic on there for a moment.
Well, I did for a moment. I don't really have anything productive to say, except that of all the things, I think in his summary, it said avoid a functioning museum. And I've seen a lot of that. So that was my only real comment.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I say it with all respect. But it's kind of like, you know, I meet up with guys. So, you know, generally I find there's a lot of folks in radio who are really passionate, broadcasting in general, but the radio group seems to just, I think, even the technical community seems to be closer to the programming than I see in television. Maybe because the television guys, you know, a lot of stuff's network. The content wasn't always created at the TV station. Where the radio station, a lot of times the content's there. But we tend to be a pretty passionate group. And, you know, when I see guys who are wheeling out, you know, Harris Stereo 80s and LPB Signature 2s, and they talk about their, you know, cleaning these up and they're going to go put it in some other station. I'm kind of like, you know, this just doesn't make any sense in a lot of ways. It doesn't make sense to the owner who's actually paying you to go do that work, because for less money, you could go buy an inexpensive contemporary product, but for sure, it's like, man, these things aren't supported. They don't have very good, you know, audio performance. And so while you may be passionate about your, you know, science fair project of resurrecting a Stereo 80, you know, I had those when they were new. They were okay, but they weren't anything that I would, you know, get super jazzed about.
There's no point in recapping a V1.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, hey, look, it's better than being off the air, and they're
Yeah.
great backups.
Sure.
But for sure, you know, I would be eradicating those things and get to something that's more contemporary. Because here's the thing, you know, as time goes on, the younger engineers, right, tend to be more IP savvy. They're less circuit level guys. And, you know, whoever follows us, we're generally not doing them any favors by having something that requires lots of circuit level electronics and, you know, troubleshooting that, because that's just not, you know, what they're great at. So old audio processors are great as backups, and audio consoles are great, you know, if that's your passion for your home studio. But you know, the cost, just to put it in perspective, like Chuck was saying, the 1 kilowatt, you know, FM transmitter all-in-one exciter. I think today, Chuck, they're, you know, even from the biggest brands, you're somewhere between $5,000 to $7,500. You know, some off brands could be even less, but say good quality ones. And I go back and say, in, you know, 1995, a 1 kilowatt FM transmitter solid state was around 20 grand. And so when you figure the cost over time, right? I mean, that's the core of your station. You talk about audio consoles, you know, in the 90s, 5 to 10 grand got you an okay audio console. Today, 5 to 10 grand, you know, you can get audio over IP for a few $1,000s. You can have a great analog broadcast board with really good performance. So for me, it's just the economics don't make any sense. Set aside the technology part of it.
And the other key point that you made was the unobtainium part. A lot of these, I mean, go price a 6AU6 today, right? So it's
Yeah,
tough to do that, right?
You can hunt around on eBay and go to ham fests.
Yeah.
And again, look, if that's your passion and you want to restore it and it's a hobby, I don't mean to be offensive. By all means, go after it. But you know, if you really want to be competitive in the marketplace with your station, it's just probably not a place for it. So that's kind of what I was meaning by the functioning museum.
Well, I knew what you meant, but most of my experience, although I had a couple FM stations that I was the director of engineering of up in South Bend, but I was down here in Noblesville and in Indianapolis. My greatest claim to fame myself was shortwave, and that's AM, and it's not even AM like on the broadcast band. In the international US shortwave band, the 5 kilohertz bandwidth. So
yeah,
what that does to audio. And I think I had an Orban Optimod shortwave. I think they actually made one for that, I think.
Mm-hmm. They sure did.
So you're familiar with that?
Yeah, there were Orban. I think they called them HF.
Yes, that's it.
Yeah.
A picture from years ago, but I didn't find one.
Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, they were a modified AM Optimod that had
AM.
yeah, and it had a different some different equalization in there. And I think the bands were different.
Sure.
It's kind of analogous to what CRL later did, a thing they called the talk processor.
Okay, now, I was just going to ask you about CRL. I don't really remember this, but we started out, I think, with the CRL and then went to the Optimod. This is back in 1985.
Yeah,
But,
CRLs, yeah, they were around then.
okay, but Radio Moscow used CRL and they somehow got it illegally and used it in Radio Moscow.
Well, for sure, you know, there were guys that I can remember a number of years ago when you know, back in the late 80s and into the 90s, where I would end up shipping things to, so being in New York, the two places I would end up shipping things that went other places would be Niagara Falls. And so you would get Canadians who would get something shipped in Niagara Falls and then I guess put it in their trunk and drive it across the border. Or we would end up sending things to New York City. And so I had to make this trip down to New York City from where I was near the capital, Albany, so a few hours away. And a colleague of mine said, "Hey, can you meet up with these guys from Columbia because they want to, you know, pay for this stuff and pick up these audio processors?" Well, here's me not thinking. I thought he meant Columbia University. No, he actually meant guys who came from Columbia. And I thought I was picking up a check and they came with cash. And here I came with Optimod. So yeah, for sure, there were guys who, like you say, would get things illegal export in the day to get stuff that they couldn't get otherwise.
I mean, but from a legal standpoint, having it go to Medellin or Cartagena in Colombia wasn't as bad as having it go to Moscow.
Well, yeah, for sure.
Not even supposed to go there at all, no matter what. It was like a technical thing that you weren't supposed to have. But Radio Moscow had CRL back in the 80s.
And my guess would be, if you know, the CRL guys probably had no clue that that's where it was going. It went through some dealer, and you know, these days exporting's a lot more. They pay a lot more attention to that.
Well, that would be their story, and they would stick to it.
Yes, for sure.
And Radio Prague in those days, Czechoslovakia, Radio Prague, I think they had CRL too, also.
I visited an AM station in Vladivostok, 100 kilowatt AM station in Vladivostok, and I was the transmitter was massive. It was probably 100 feet wide, and there was all these babushkas walking around with white lab coats, changing tubes all the time. And I was trying to figure out the meters. They were all in Cyrillic.
Oh, interesting.
On this transmitter, and I finally found the ones that were probably the cathode current. And I said, "Was this, you know, that?" And they said, "Yeah." And I said, "Well, you know, they're barely tickling. I mean, you're a 100 kilowatt AM station. Why are these barely moving in the modulators?" And they said, and I said, "Do you have an audio processor?" And they said, "Oh, yes, we have an Orban." And they pointed at one of those Orban AMs they had, but it was underneath a desk over in the corner, dark. And I said, "Well, why do you have it there?" They said, "Well, when we put it in place, the transmitter used too much power."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I told him, I said, "I can sell you a 10 kilowatt transmitter. You'll get better coverage, and you'll sound better, and it'll be less expensive to run."
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that, Chuck.
What year was that? What year?
That would have been in the probably about 1980.
Oh, okay. So
Yeah.
it was, yeah.
It was a long time ago.
Oh, yeah, it was still the Soviet Union then.
Yes, it was.
Well, you know, Chuck, you mentioned, you know, power consumption and AM transmitters. You know, I probably experienced myself 3 or 4 times when I swapped out, went from like an MW50 to a DX50, and had the power company come after the first month's reading and were suspicious that the meter had gone bad. And so despite explaining to them, we went from something that, you know, was now I don't know, 80 plus, almost 90% efficient from something that was far, far less. You know, it was a fruitless discussion. And one of the places they actually swapped the meter out 3 times before they finally believed that, no, we just consumed less power now. It was, you know, it's always kind of an interesting discussion. I would have thought it would have been obvious, but I guess not so.
Comments from anybody else? Mark, Dale, Steve? Oh, there's
Oh, there
one.
you
Yep.
go. There's the
There-
Optimod. Yeah, HF,
Sure is.
right? Yep.
Sure is. Yep.
I was going to say, I thought it was brown.
That was a long time ago,
It was.
1985 through about 2005. We had that. And then the shortwave station in Noblesville got torn down and all the equipment sent to South Carolina.
Anybody else like to contribute to the stories? I think we could go on for a long time because there's a number of us that have been around a long time.
Oh, by the
All
way,
right.
I got here just barely on time,
Well done.
and I have a brand new computer and it works fine in the preview. But when I tried to connect the first time, it wouldn't work. So I had to go back. I had to go back to my old computer, which is sitting right next to me. But
Well, I'm sure you'll figure it out the next day or so.
well, I'm going to. Well, you know where I'm going, right?
Yeah, that's right. Good for
Okay.
you.
I'm going to Casablanca on Monday.
Frankly,
Oh,
my
very
dear.
nice.
Yeah. Now the question is, has everybody here seen the movie Casablanca?
Sure.
They have a dress code at Rick's Cafe.
Hmm.
And so I have a tuxedo, dinner jacket, and black pants. My daughter tells me I absolutely cannot wear brown shoes. Is that true?
I think so. Yeah, probably
Yeah.
so.
Yeah, probably.
All right. Do anybody of you remember George Goebel?
Yeah.
Yeah.
In 1969, he was on Johnny Carson with Bob Hope and Dean Martin. And he gave this line: "Did you ever feel that the world was a tuxedo and you were a pair of brown shoes?"
It's ironic you mentioned Rick's Cafe because I've got a buddy that the first radio station I worked for at WPGU in Urbana, Illinois, the University of Illinois.
Okay.
He and I went to school at the same time, and he just got back and posted pictures of Rick's Cafe. He just got back from there. So
From Casablanca, Morocco.
yeah,
Okay.
Yeah.
And then, in case you don't know it, in Indiana, there is a Rick's Boatyard Cafe.
I know. Yeah, well thought of.
Yeah. That one I've been to.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'd like to thank you, Rich, for sharing your thoughts and your ideas, and I think it stimulated a lot of thought on many of our minds. Because even though we may work in television or be retired, many of us still keep a hand in radio stations, and so I thank you for your well-considered thoughts.
Yeah, not a problem. And I think one of your points about we all still kind of have a hand in it, despite what our current role may be. I think some of these things are the opportunity for some mentorship. I think we probably all had the opportunity to learn from guys when we were younger who had a lot of experience, and there's just a lot of tips and tricks that you pick up that don't come from a book, and somebody only gets from the scars of actually doing something. And so
Thanks for the segue into the last comment on this page.
Oh, look at that. Yes, my honorarium, you can add this to it when you send the check out.
There you go. So yeah, SBE, we're all signing up now for the 2022 program for the SBE mentor program. It's a good program. Many of us are involved in it, have been for a number of years. So get involved. It's a good thing. And just for the reasons that Rich just mentioned.
Yeah,
Okay.
it's a bit, you know, I for sure, I benefited greatly from mentorship, and, you know, I was fortunate over the years to go back and work with some of the guys who had helped me, you know, early on, and it was, you know, it was very rewarding. So,
Absolutely.
well, thank you everyone for the time to join you guys and chat a little bit about, you know, a subject that I find pretty interesting. So,
Stop back
thanks.
by anytime, Rich. Don't be a stranger.
Well, again, thanks. Have a nice evening, everyone.
Take care, all. Bye-bye.